Well, we're really relieved to see you. Okay, I'm very glad to introduce to you, or perhaps you know him already, most of us do perhaps, Paulo Lemos-Horta, who is affiliated to New York University in Abu Dhabi in the Department of Literature, and he's specializing in the translation history of the 1001 Nights, and also I think in influences of the 1001 Nights in world literature. And he will speak about collaborators and translators.
Thank you. I chose to speak on just one collaboration, actually, between Richard Burton and John Payne for today. Partly because there may be a German connection, and that's actually the part that I'm least certain about, but I thought it might be a good place to talk about, good connection to this place. The pre-Raphaelite poet John Payne is a largely forgotten figure in the history of the 1001 Nights, demoted to a supporting character in a story dominated by the famous traveler and translator Richard Francis Burton. By the late 1870s, the mythology of Burton was in full force in the bohemian circles of London, where Payne, setting aside a promising career in law, sought to establish himself, first as an original author of pre-Raphaelite poetry, and subsequently as a literary translator. Like other writers who inhabited the pre-Raphaelite circle, Payne was enthralled by Burton as an explorer, adventurer, and guide to the quote-unquote decadence of the East. As a barrister with literary ambitions, Payne longed to be a part of the overlapping bohemian circles around Leicester Square, in which figures like Burton held court in the 1860s. In Bertolini's restaurant, Dante Gabriel Rossetti and the pre-Raphaelite poets met, along with their stunners, and Burton presided over meetings over the Cannibal Club. This free-thinking anthropological society had been founded by Burton in 1863 and met to discuss sexually transgressive subjects like phallic worship at meetings that they called orgies. Payne's edition of the Nights would develop in this potent atmosphere of decadent London and through his engagement with Burton. In a poem dedicated to Burton, Payne expressed the dissatisfaction he felt revisiting the grey, dreary London after 12 years of immersion in the 1001 Nights. It was like a disenchantment that greets the sleeper who wakes from an entrancing dream. For Payne, the sweetest fruit of his 12 years of labor had been the chance to call Richard Burton a friend. Yet by 1889, when Payne penned this poem, he would have been aware that Burton's own translation of the 1001 Nights had borrowed heavily from his own, so much so that another translator might have made the accusation of plagiarism. Burton's debt to Payne has been an open secret of scholarship on the Nights for many years. Mia Gerhardt observed it, Robert Irwin remarked upon this fact in his Arabian Nights Companion. Even the popular scholar of myth, Joseph Campbell, marveled that the plagiarism was not more widely known. Given the gravity of the charge and Burton's undeniable guilt, the biographers and scholars who note Burton's plagiarism are continually puzzled that it is not yet common knowledge. There seems to be little incentive for scholars to rightfully identify Burton's text as the work of an obscure poet who barely registers in print today. So, as glaring as Burton's plagiarism is to anyone who cares to compare the two versions, Payne's own translation of the Nights possesses its own secrets. If it is easy to establish that Burton borrowed from Payne, it is harder to determine how Payne even accomplished his translation in the first place. In 1878, Payne celebrated the success of his translation of the works of a French medieval poet by making a surprising announcement that his next project would be an unexpurgated version of the 1001 Nights. However, there appears to have been a considerable obstacle to the successful completion of this project. Payne may not have been proficient in Arabic. Paine's biographer, Thomas Wright, makes some plausible claims that Paine had learnt a series of languages: German, French, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, Greek, Latin, Turkish, Persian, and Arabic by the age of 19 in the year 1859. However, as Robert Irwin points out in the Arabian Nights Companion, the Arabic grammar that he might have needed to teach himself Arabic at that time in England had not yet been published. According to contemporary accounts, Paine did not start studying Arabic until he started his work on the Nights in 1877 at the earliest. 4 years later, in 1881, the first volume was set for the printers. The pace of Paine's progress in 1883 and 1884 was even more unreal and invited open amazement from his correspondents. Paine had taken 4 years between 1874 and 1878 to complete his translation from French of one volume of the poetry of François Villon. In 1883, Paine published 3 thick volumes of his Nights, and in 1884 he published 4. Never again would Paine approach this pace. What was his secret? Manuscript evidence and anonymous essays published by Paine himself would suggest that rather than translating directly from the Arabic, he rewrote other translations published notably in English and in German. He likely benefited further from cribs and transliterations by young Orientalist friends. This context provides an explanation for why Paine never protested Burton's blatant theft of his work. Years after the events, Paine still sought to dissuade his biographer Thomas Wright from Wright's plan to publicly prove the case of Burton's plagiarism. Correspondence between Paine and Burton reveals the context for these borrowings. Paine's rewriting of the Nights was built on the principles of pre-Raphaelite aesthetics, not philological or ethnographic knowledge. And this meant he was in need of a champion who could offer legitimacy to his version of the Arabic story collection. Into this vacuum stepped Richard Francis Burton, whose reputation as an Orientalist gave credibility to the project, and whose networks of collaborators supplied the scholarly essays and apparatus that were seen as a critical component of any edition of the Nights. If Burton produced his Nights by rewriting Paine, rather than translating from the original, Paine himself had sought to use Burton to hide the intertext that lurked under his palimpsest version of the 1001 Nights. I'm looking around for water, but without much. So, John Paine's path to the Nights. John Paine's path to the 1001 Nights was a circuitous one, and his first encounter of the story collection inauspicious. He claimed he had come across the translation of Edward Lane when a boy, quote, seizing upon it with all the eagerness of the youthful lover of the Arabian Nights. But he was quickly repelled and disheartened by the cramped and unfamiliar style. Thank you. Paine would only return to his youthful fascination of the world of the Nights as he sought to enter the bohemian world of the Pre-Raphaelites, whose center was Dante Gabriel Rossetti. The Pre-Raphaelite circle seemed to be particularly invested in the Nights. Even by the standards of the Victorian era, the Rossetti family had a tradition of reading out loud the Nights every few years and owned several different versions. Gabriel admitted to being enthralled as a boy by the Old English translation after Galland. At the age of 7, he had written a play based on Aladdin. At the age of 12, he had produced a series of sketches. Paine was also attuned to Christina Rossetti's poetic engagement with the tales. When Paine returned to the Nights at the age of 37, his youthful encounter with Lane's edition formed an important negative example. Reading and rereading Lane, Paine was persuaded that a scholarly translation was antithetical to the form of imaginative rewriting that he yearned to accomplish. Lane's Nights had not only discouraged Paine from exploring the universe of the tales in his youth, but more fundamentally from the practice of translation. These issues are highlighted in 2 now forgotten essays that Paine published anonymously, and which set out his essential approach to the 1001 Nights. For Paine, the problem he confronted was not the approach of a particular translator, but with translation itself. He lamented, quote, the inartistic expedients to which the translator is constantly driven in the endeavor to realize his double aim of producing a book that should be at once scientific and popular. Paine's essay on the 1001 Nights contrasts artistry, craft, and literature with philosophy, scholarship, and translation. If, as Paine believed, a text must ultimately be measured by its ability to capture the genius of its own place and era, Lane's version was lacking. In a word, it was unreadable. For the success of a version of the Nights, literary graces of style and diction were at least as necessary, Paine believed, as accuracy and scholarship. Galland's French version of the Nights was privileged by him as a model. Paine lauded Galland for imbuing the Nights with his own charming style, the fine flower of the literary manner of the 18th century, partaking at once of Voltaire and Diderot. In contrast, the absence of style in Lane was damning. If only purely literary faculties of comparable power could have been deployed in Lane's version, it might have proven a success. In this way, Paine establishes the strictly aesthetic grounds for his own version of the Nights, whether as a rewriting or a translation. For Paine, Lane's Nights was not just an unsuccessful translation, it demonstrated the limits of any translation from Arabic into English. Lane's Nights had taught Paine that Arabic was a language essentially opposed to English. Translation between the two languages therefore necessitated cumbersome paraphrase or the accumulation of notes that, however valuable from a scholarly point of view, quote, are almost invariably undesirable in a work of purely literary or fictional character. As evidence, he cites Lane's achievement of making his English text, quote, a matrix for the reception of crude nodules of untranslated Arabic. From an aesthetic point of view, a blemish of a very serious nature. Translation would seem to entail philology, not for Paine. He resents the encroachment of philology and science into the realm of literature. And I quote, the two styles, artistic and scholastic, are as incompatible as oil and water, Paine ventures, with the result that any attempt to amalgamate them will assuredly result in the loss of the best qualities of each. He presents the two approaches not as two different styles of translation, but as irreconcilable modes of writing, the first associated with fiction and literature, and the second with translation. These forgotten anonymous essays represent Paine's only attempt to situate himself explicitly with regard to his precursors and to stake his claim to a purely literary conception of the Nights. In them, Paine had effectively acknowledged his plan to rewrite rather than translate the 1001 Nights from Arabic. And he would come to regret the publication of these essays, even though they were anonymous. In the preface to his Nights, Paine would be much more careful in how he presented his project. Unlike other translators, he offered no account of how he came to Arabic or to the 1001 Nights. He never stakes his credential and gives only a minimal explanation of his sources, claiming that he used the Macnaghten edition but also collated with the Bullock and the Breslau, adopting from one and the other such variants, additions, and corrections as seemed best calculated for him to improve the general effect with the spirit of the work. In fact, Paine's use of material from these different editions was more likely a consequence of his process of rewriting previous translations rather than an engagement with an original Arabic text. Sorry. Paine would draw from Pre-Raphaelite style as he crafted his own version of the story collection. While Lane had used the Nights as a receptacle for historical and ethnographic commentary, Paine undertook his rendition of the Nights solely as a work of art. His goal was to recreate the medieval Arabic story collection as a work of contemporary European literature. He inherited from the Pre-Raphaelites the medieval aesthetic of his version of the Nights, which is riddled with archaic and foreign words. He imbues his Nights with a languid nostalgia, a neo-romantic quality that served to render the explicit material less offensive. On the level of diction and syntax, he would borrow from Gabriele Rossetti, but also more broadly on theme and style. Payne presents his Nights as a purely literary work, produced with the sole objective of supplying cultivated readers with a representative version of the most famous work of narrative fiction in existence. This was not a Nights intended to illuminate the customs and manners of Arab peoples. The only credentials Payne draws attention to in his preface are his original works of pre-Raphaelite poetry and his translation of François Villon. He includes only occasional notes and no comprehensive index. This was not a Nights for a middle-class readership. He limited the printing to 500 copies to give the literary volumes the status of rare books, and he consciously set out for a lavish attention to margins, fonts, and illustrations to make his prohibitively priced, privately circulated volumes into objects of art. Payne's turn to the Nights is understandable in terms of pre-Raphaelite aesthetics and late Victorian decadence. However, he was setting himself an almost impossible task. A report in a literary magazine indicates that Payne was suggesting in the fall of 1878 that, incredibly, he had already completed the bulk of his Nights, just after publishing his translation of Villon from the French. After this notice in the Athenaeum, there would be no way of withdrawing from the project and saving his literary reputation. 3 years later, in 1881, the first volume was set for the printers, and a notice limiting the circulation to 500 subscribers was issued. By 1885, Payne had published 8 volumes of his Nights. This was nothing short of marvelous. As a contemporary observer had already intuited based on these anonymous essays, Payne was not translating from Arabic, but rewriting ever translations. Payne proceeded by using Lane and previous English versions as his basis and resorted to German, French, or transliterations provided by his collaborators whenever he could. Payne himself emphasized he was collating from different editions of the Nights to produce the best effect. Payne's actual practice of rewriting the Nights avoided the complex process of manuscript comparison by considering the literary merits of his source material instead. A concern with good English form shapes his decisions throughout the translation. The rhyming prose of the original, the rhyming prose of the original is rejected as a model for any English rendering, an excrescence born of the excessive facilities for rhyme afforded by a language whose every speaker is a poet. Payne's contempt for his original was clear in every attempt to demonstrate the merits of his own translation. A sample transliteration of the Arabic in his preface is included to invite readers to marvel at the way in which he has adopted the original to the genius of English prose. For him, it was like imposing order upon chaos, breaking up the endless phrases of the original into convenient sentences and purging them from the excrescences of tautology and repetition that deface the text, end quote. Payne's distance from the original Arabic text helps to explain the choices that he makes. One of his most formidable challenges was how to craft a consistent and a coherent work of literature from such varied sources. Style would prove Payne's answer to the challenge. Attempting a purely literary rewriting of the Nights rather than a translation, he produced a work of contemporary European literature. Payne's version of the Nights has undeniable literary merits, but without the legitimacy afforded by real credentials as a translator of Arabic, its author stood on shaky grounds. By the appearance of the first volume in 1884, Payne had every reason to expect a hostile response from the well-established contingent of Lane supporters headed by his great-nephews, Stanley Lane Poole and Reginald Stuart Poole. When Payne tested the waters in the late 1870s with his anonymous essays, it had been a member of the Lane Poole clique who had issued an immediate and crushing response. According to this critic, the translator of the Night should have knowledge of classical and modern Arabic, familiarity with Arabic culture and history, the critical skill to select the best manuscript, and good English style. He found the anonymous author wanting in every category, noting numerous errors of translation in the samples included in these anonymous essays. The anonymous writer's mistakes regarding history were laughable. The history of caliphs he provided was riddled with equally ridiculous errors. Most importantly, the member of the Lane-Poole clique suspected that the anonymous writer was in fact not translating from Arabic. He notices that the writer transliterates using the German S, where an English translator would have used Z. The question of English style for him was moot, for if a translator cannot translate, it little matter in what forms his results appear. When Paine made his plans for literary nights clear in the Athenaeum, he had to confront another formidable opponent from the Orientalist establishment, Reverend George Percy Badger, a professor of Arabic at Oxford. Responding to the advertisement for Paine's Nights, Badger wrote in a newspaper, "It was regrettable and strange that the only recommendation put forward on behalf of the translator of so voluminous and difficult a book from Arabic was that he had translated Villon from French." Paine did not have the confidence to respond to Badger's questions directly. Indeed, he would never assert in print that he knew Arabic. Rather, he set his agents in charge of handling the subscriptions to print a very hostile response to the Orientalist inquiries. They began by reprimanding the Oxford Orientalist for having aired his concerns publicly and advising him that he should privately address all his concerns to them. Following this veiled legal threat, the agents assured readers that Paine had long been known to his friends as an accomplished Persianist, also somebody who happened to know Arabic. These public attacks on the credibility of his Nights led Paine to strongly pursue an association with the one Orientalist whose reputation might shield him, the legendary Richard Burton. Burton had made favorable noises when Paine had announced his plan to produce a Nights for private subscribers. Writing to the Athenaeum in November of 1881, Burton claimed that he was encouraged by Paine's unabridged translation of the French poet François Villon. This might have encouraged Paine to believe that he had Burton's support, but the famous explorer had another agenda in making these statements. He clearly marked the Arabic story collection as his own territory and suggested that if Paine's version did not give the 1001 Nights fair play, then he would have to produce his own and more authentic version of the Eastern text. In these first discussions of Paine's Nights, Burton began to weave the myth that he would immortalize in his own version of the story collection. He thus claims that he began his work on the Arabian Nights in the 1850s, the decade of his famous pilgrimage to Mecca and Medina. These claims were, to use one of Burton's own neologisms, unfacts. He states that he had made significant progress in translating the Nights several decades before Paine had the idea, and was only a year away from finishing his own translation. In truth, however, Burton would not begin serious work on his version until 3 years after he was writing this in 1881. Burton's claims were a bluff intended to demonstrate the antecedents and the greater legitimacy of his work on the Nights as compared to Paine's edition of the tales. Whether Paine understood Burton's endgame in these statements or not, his own vulnerability as a non-translator of the Nights drew him to the eminent Orientalist. Almost immediately, Paine wrote to Burton to propose a collaboration on the translation of the story collection, the terms of which were very much to Burton's advantage. Paine suggested that Burton contribute notes, commentary, perhaps render the poetry, while he himself would compose the prose, doing what Burton regarded as pony work. Even more generous was Paine's proposal for giving Burton a portion of the royalties, so much so that even Burton, who was in financial difficulty, thought it too much. Or so it seems. Burton was not interested in pursuing a real partnership. He wrote that he would be happy to help Paine in any way, but he could not accept Paine's terms for a collaboration. He explains that he did not know how much time he could have to devote to such a work because he was a rolling stone. Burton most likely refused Paine's offer because he wanted to reserve the right to publish his own version. Burton would follow through on his offer of help by addressing Paine's specific need for the kind of scholarly essays on the Nights that were now considered essential to any translation. After Paine's first anonymous essays had been eviscerated by the Lane-Poole clique, he lacked the confidence to tackle the challenge himself, and he turned to Burton. While Burton claimed he did not have time to help, he did recommend free scholars who might. Burton's list was guaranteed to elevate Paine's anxieties. It included the famous Orientalist E.H. Palmer, the Cambridge Arabist Robertson Smith, who would later conclude that Paine translated the Nights from German, and the Reverend Badger, who was already ranged among Paine's enemies. Burton's motives in mentioning these names are unclear. He obviously had been following Paine's progress and could not have failed to notice the very public attack the Reverend Badger had mounted against Paine. Was this Burton's way of reminding Paine of his vulnerability and ensuring his absolute dependence on Burton's help? With this tenuous alliance with Paine established, Burton could take on the role of promoter of Paine's volumes. He personally undertook to sell subscriptions to Paine's Nights, requesting in June of 1882 that Paine send him a list of advertisements so he could place many copies. He reassured Paine that there would be no difficulty battling the L'impôt clique. Paine asked Burton if it was possible to prevent any reviews of the work, but Burton made it clear to Paine he didn't think it was worthwhile to suppress negative publicity originating in Lane's descendants. A public dispute, however, was the last thing that Paine wanted. Burton seemed to understand the nature of Paine's predicament and was willing to come to his aid, but only in a manner that would benefit his own plans for the Nights. When Paine wrote to him of his trepidations, Burton responded on October 8, 1882, "Of course, I don't know Arabic, but who does?" One may know a part of it, a corner of it, of a field, but bah, end quote. Burton may have imagined that Paine feared the L'impôt clique would accuse Paine of having imperfect knowledge of Arabic, while Paine seems to have feared that they would accuse him again of having no Arabic. Or perhaps Burton knew that Paine lacked the Arabic proficiency to translate the Nights and simply did not care, as he himself was in the habit of plagiarizing and rewriting from other sources. Drumming up subscribers for Paine's Nights, Burton quickly realized that there was a greater demand than could be satisfied by Paine's promised 500 copies. Burton asked Paine in 1883 if there was no way of getting around this difficulty of issuing more copies. As a solution, Burton suggested maybe he could reprint Paine's texts in his own name. He added parenthetically, this of course would be in Paine's interest, perhaps indicating an openness to negotiations over the royalties. Burton's proposal seems very similar to the terms of Paine's initial offer of collaboration, in which Paine would supply the prose and Burton the commentary, but Burton now proposed to print this collaborative version solely under his own name. Burton knew that Paine was in his debt. Paine's reply to Burton's proposal has not been preserved, but it is unlikely that he could flatly refuse. Neither man returned to the matter in correspondence until April of 1884, when Paine's final volume was nearing completion. Burton wrote to Paine matter-of-factly announcing that he would now begin his own version of the Nights. Burton also made what he admitted was a somewhat indiscreet request. Could Paine send him all his manuscripts? Despite his claims of earlier work on the Nights, Burton evidently did not at that time possess Arabic manuscripts of the tales. Once he decided to embark on his own version in 1884, he did acquire copies of the Macnaghten, Breslau, and Bullock editions. This may indicate that initially Burton intended to, at least considered producing his own original translation. But even if he started with that intention, he quickly realized he simply did not have the time, both because he was engaged in more pressing projects, but because Paine had set an impossible precedent with the speed of his publication. Burton could not, sharing the same list of subscribers, fail to match Paine's pace. Such a pace could not be maintained by a translator, and Burton would, in effect, return to his original plan to reprint Paine's Nights. Burton would not mention the gentleman's agreement he seems to have struck with Paine when he returned with gusto to the theme of the precedence of his Nights. Though Burton had no specimens of translation that predated Paine's, he felt he could establish his antecedents by asserting that he had begun telling the stories of the Nights during his travels in Arabia. In his Nights preface, Burton recalled sharing the tales around the campfire and communion with the desert Bedouin. The anecdote misrepresents Burton's actual engagement, given his unmistakable debt to Paine's translation. In keeping with his attempt to justify his version of the Nights as a product of experience traveling in Arabia, Burton resorted to a veneer of Arabic authenticity to differentiate his text from the text he was rewriting. professing the romantic belief that poetry is the most characteristic expression of the people, Burton argued that to ignore the rhyme and rhythm of the Knight's poetry would be to remain deaf to the Bedouin cadences that could still be heard in the urbane Arabic of Macnaghten's edition. Burton boasted in his commentary that he alone would preserve the original rhyming prose that Lane had thought untranslatable and Paine had rejected as foreign to the genes of English. In an ostentatious statement of his method of translation, Burton claimed that he would incorporate the orphan tales told by Hannah to Galan into his Knights by translating them first from French into Arabic and then back into English. In terms of contemporary translation studies, Burton seemed to adopt a practice of translation that was intentionally foreignizing, departing from the conventions of a good English style in order to give the reader a sense of the distinctive qualities of the foreign text. Lawrence Venuti, the preeminent theorist of translation today, thus uses Burton's Knights as a prime example of foreignizing in his seminal work, The Translator's Invisibility. Venuti relies heavily on Burton's claims in his preface that he includes assonance and alliteration and rhyming prose. Venuti also argues that Burton used archaicisms, neologisms, and foreign loanwords with the intention of producing a foreignizing effect. Burton's diction did make his Knights strange and somewhat unpalatable to his contemporaries, but his use of language in the Knights was not exactly original, and his intention was not only to produce a foreignizing text. Rewriting from Paine, Burton felt the need to exaggerate his own mannerisms of style. Both men admired the translation theory and practice of Dante Gabriel Rossetti. But Paine had beaten Burton to the idea of creating a pre-Raphaelite version of the Knights. The fabric of Burton's style would be woven from the same texture of underlining medievalism, the search for beautiful words, foreign, archaic, and invented. However, as he rewrote Paine's text, Burton would intensify the pre-Raphaelite aesthetic, rendering his version even more artificial and cluttering it with ever more obscure and inventive words. Burton pushed this aesthetic of archaic words and invented words almost to the point of self-parody. It may have recalled to the Victorian reader Malek's satire of the vocabulary of the pre-Raphaelites. Quote, "Take a packet of fine selected early English, containing no words but such as are obsolete and unintelligible. Pour this into double the quantity of entirely new English, which must have never been used before, and which you must compose yourself, fresh. As it is wanted, mix these together thoroughly till they assume a color quite different from any tongue that was ever spoken, and the material will be ready for use." To Burton's critics, this would appear a precise description of his method. In light of the contemporary opinion that Burton stretched the boundaries of the English language, his text might be seen as foreignizing, but because he rewrote Paine, Burton's text also incorporates many elements of translation that fit within Venuti's category of domesticating. In Burton's case, the dichotomy between foreignizing and domesticating translation do not make sense. They do not do justice to the complexities and contradictions of his stated intention, his method, and his anxieties of influence. A reading of Burton's Knights makes it clear that while occasionally he does make use of stylistic flourishes that would be classified as foreignizing, more often than not, his version of a tale differs very little from Paine's. Even working from Paine, Burton could not afford to rewrite every word, as if he was to keep falling behind. Even working from Paine, Burton could not afford the time to rewrite every word. He would fall behind Paine's astounding rate of publication. Burton would publish 16 volumes from 1884 to 1886, and by the time he reached the last volumes, he hardly bothered to disguise his plagiarism, copying whole passages from Paine, verbatim. Yet even in the earlier volumes, when Burton put more time and effort into rewriting Paine's text, he used stylistic embellishments only strategically. In episodes of heightened sexual, violent, and comic tension, or all free, he would accentuate alliteration, assonance, and rhyme to lend the text a promised semblance of Arabic rhythm. In The Hunchback's Tale, for instance, when a tailor and his wife entertain and abuse the hunchback at dinner, Burton enhances the cruel humor of the episode with his style. Quote, "Presently the tailor's wife took a great fit of fish and gave it in a gobbet to the gobbo." Gobbo is Italian for hunchback, right? "Presently the tailor's wife took a great fit of fish and gave it in a gobbet to the gobbo, stopping his mouth with her hand and saying, 'By Allah, thou must down at a single gulp, and I will not give thee time to chew it.' So he bolted it, and there went a stiff bone which stuck in his gullet, and his hour being come, he died." The evidence that Burton plagiarized Payne and Payne had rewritten other translations of the Nights before him has significant implications for Burton's legacy within translation studies. Burton's Nights is not really the epitome of the foreignizing and subversive translation, as posited by Venuti, not only because it is not a translation. Burton does test and often exceed the limits of English in his famously unreadable version of the Nights, crammed with neologisms, archaisms, and foreignisms, an array of devices alien to English. But the foreignizing feel of Burton was not intended in the sense that modern scholars of translation imagine. His stylistic excesses were largely the byproduct of his haste and his need to differentiate his version from Payne's. Payne had already hit upon the idea of relying upon stylization to conceal his borrowing from other texts. The highly aesthetic and ornate style of the Pre-Raphaelites was used by Payne to mask the fact that he was not actually translating. In confronting the same dilemma, Burton would take the same style to even greater extremes to hide his even greater distance from the original. Burton, who despised the Orientalism of the untraveled observer, or even of authors who travel too late to overcome the biases of their youth and education, ironically inherited the Orientalism of the untraveled Payne, along with the text and the basis of his own translation. Perhaps this unlikely inheritance constituted one of the reasons why he felt entitled to rewrite Payne, adopting the prose and imprinting it with the rhythms of his own experience of Arab lands and dialects. The unease with inheriting Payne's prose, with its attendant armchair romance of the East, certainly spurred Burton in his attempt to graft what he considered to be the essential insights and lessons from his experience as a traveler in his commentary. In this manner, the debt to Payne provided the impetus to Burton to accentuate his own experience and prejudices as a traveler in his commentary, as in the prose text itself. And so, the imprint of the unacknowledged co-author Payne is felt precisely in those moments when Burton appears to assert himself most individually and unmistakably in his stylistic flourishes and idiosyncratic observations. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this glimpse of the more shady sides of translating the 1001 Nights. We have about 30 seconds for questions, 5 minutes. So please, the floor is yours. Robert.
Earlier in the year at a conference in Berlin on Wettstein, who was Prussian consul in Damascus in the 1850s. Wettstein rushes around the city collecting manuscripts, buying them up in bulk, shipping them out to Germany, selling them on to libraries and whatever, various institutions. Burton, as consul in Damascus in the 1860s, what he does there is copiously recorded by him and his wife. He shows no interest whatsoever in Arabic manuscripts or in Arabic literature. He uses lots of other things, ancient pre-Islamic inscriptions and toponymy and so forth, but there's no sign that the Arabian Nights or any work of Arabic literature is of interest to him. And then Norman Penzer, in his bibliography of Richard Burton, claims that Richard Burton spent decades of his life collecting manuscripts of the Arabian Nights. Where Penzer gets this from, I do not know. Mm-hmm. Burton never says such a thing. If Burton collected lots of manuscripts of the Arabian Nights, what on earth happened to them? These kind of manuscripts are valuable, much sought after. But they just, yes, it's thin air. I think you've done very well in putting a stake through Burton's heart.
No comments?
The obvious question, names. I mean, it's fascinating to listen to you saying that Payne used other translations. But who were those people who did those translations? What are your conjectures? Who would have been available? Who could have been exposed?
Well, I'm obviously trying to save my best material for my book, which is coming out. But I think one of the biggest revelations I have is that Payne borrowed from some translations we no longer pay attention to, and there you could see him lifting entire sentences.
So you want us to remain patient until the book is published?
One might have to. The German figures I wouldn't mind some more help with, because I find it remarkable, and that's not what I'm focusing on in my book. I'm focusing more on his borrowing from other English translators. But it's remarkable that independently, one could dismiss the lane pole clique as being defensive, but how come somebody at Cambridge and other people independently were arriving at this, seeing these traces of transliterations from German? This is, I think that's a very odd coincidence for different people to have reached that conclusion.
Other questions? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.